Okay, so now let's talk about discretionary versus automatic fiscal policy. So we just saw kind of examples of discretionary fiscal policy when we looked at fiscal stabilization, where the government was kind of actively changing, capital G in terms of government purchases or the tax rate or tax revenues in order to push us back to this long run equilibrium, perhaps in a faster way, right? So discretionary fiscal policy is the government actively making changes to G, capital G or capital T, government purchase or the tax rate, in order to push us back to long run equilibrium or kind of stop some volatility. The government actively making changes to capital G or capital T to bring us back to long run equilibrium, or at least stop some of the limit the gaps, the output gaps, long run equilibrium. Now this is different than kind of automatic fiscal policy, which has to do with how our tax and transfer system is built and how it's designed. And the idea being that, when your real Y is increasing, the taxes are going up, which is kind of making that simple multiplier smaller and making it so our economy just doesn't bounce around as much due to changes, due to aggregate demand or aggregate supply shocks. So automatic has to do with the design of the tax and transfer system. So for example, when Y increases, our tax revenue goes up, or maybe our spending goes down, or if Y goes down, the government automatically starts spending more money or is bringing less in taxes. This is going to cause the simple multiplier to go down, or causing that change in Y to be smaller, right? So it's just like dampening some of these effects of the shocks. And so why don't we erase this board and we can talk about, the difference between two kind of equivalent economies where one has a high tax rate and one has a lower one, to kind of understand the effects. But let's make sure I should connect it in a better way than the simple multiplier being smaller. Remember, the simple multiplier is 1 over 1 minus z. Remember, this is like the size of the shift of the AD curve from a change in capital A. And remember that the z equals b times 1 minus t minus m. This is the marginal propensity to consume, this is the tax rate, and this is m. So economy with a high tax rate is going to have a low, high tax rate has a smaller z. A smaller z means a smaller simple multiplier, which means smaller kind of horizontal shifts of our AD curve. And so in that way, our economy is going to be fluctuating in a smaller fluctuations in an economy with a low tax rate, which is going to bounce around a lot. But let's kind of look at that graphically. So let's imagine there's two economies that are exactly the same, but with one, we have this high tax rate over here, and we're going to have a low tax rate over here. Price, real Y, and this is, and let's imagine everything else about these economies is the same. So here's our Y star, here's our AS curve, here's our Y star, here's our AS curve. And now when we draw our AD curve, we have to be a little bit careful, right? Because this lowercase t, the tax rate, is influencing the shape of our AD curve. Remember, if there's a high tax rate, Z is relatively small. So we have a flat AE curve, but a steep AD curve. So the AD curve for this economy is going to be relatively steep. Where if we have a low tax rate, we have a high Z, or marginal propensity to spend, which means a steep AE curve and a relatively flat AD curve. That's supposed to be going. Let's pretend that goes right through there. All right, so there's our AD curve. So we're at P0 in both these economies. But this tax rate is influencing the shape of this AD curve. Now remember, the size of this, the horizontal shift of the AD curve relates to the simple multiplier. And here, if this tax rate is high, then Z is small. And this is all relative, obviously. Z is large. And remember, the simple multiplier is one over 1 minus Z. And Z's between 0 and 1, so the closer Z is to 1, the bigger this simple multiplier. And so what's happening here is if there is some kind of aggregate demand shock in both these economies of the same size, well, in this economy, this AD, so let's say it's an expansionary AD shock, this horizontal shift is, remember, the simple multiplier times the change in A. It's going to be, relatively small. It's going to be hard for me to draw this, but if we have an AD curve, and hopefully that's still showing up on the screen, with a relatively low tax rate, because the simple multiplier is larger over here, this horizontal shift of the AD curve is going to be larger. And so small changes in capital A are going to send this economy, like this AD curve, shifting around a lot. Right? Whereas it's going to be more stable around Y star here. That if we have these AD shocks, it's going to cause our AD curve to shift a bit less. Then over here, what's going to shift a bit more. And so this economy is going to have these like big business cycles where there's big peaks and troughs if they don't have much automatic stabilizers, if they have a low tax rate. Where economy with a higher tax rate, these shocks are going to kind of not have as big of an effect. I mean, AS shocks will have a smaller effect on real Y because the AD curve is steeper. But also, the AD curve is just going to shift around a lot less, right? Because it's only shifting around by the simple multiplier by the change in A, and that simple multiplier is small if this tax rate is high. So that's why we consider these tax rates to be automatic stabilizers. They're automatically built into our system, and what they do is they kind of dampen these shocks. They don't make these shocks as extreme as if you had like a low tax rate. So this business cycles will be much more smooth than these ones, or much less extreme than what's going to happen over here. So automatic stabilizers seem to do quite well in kind of controlling the big peaks and troughs of an economy. So if you have a high built-in tax rate, it's kind of stopping your economy from bouncing around Y star as much as what would happen if you had a low tax rate where there's much bigger kind of oscillations around Y star. But there are some kind of practical limitations to discretionary policy. And we've kind of seen these in play in some of the last few big stimulus packages, right? The first one is, there's going to be lags. So by the time you decide that there's something to do, or the government decides what to do, there's legislative lags in terms of, coming to an agreement on the kinds of policies, the kind of spending you want to make. But there's also execution lags. Unless you have a bunch of quote-unquote shovel-ready projects, it's going to take a while to kind of vet some of these projects and begin actually spending that money, which is designed to increase, the shifted aggregate demand curve in the right way. So there's going to be uncertain lags. So both kind of legislative as well as execution lags. It's going to be really hard to fine tune. You kind of know the direction where you want to shift this aggregate demand curve, but it might not be clear the exact amount of money you need to spend to get you exactly to, what Y star is. You might have an idea about different multipliers for different areas or different groups of people, but those are kind of just estimates, and you're just trying to come up with an approximation that's going to get you back to Y star. So hard to know how much to increase G, or to change. Maybe I should say change, because you could be in a inflationary gap and changing your G, I guess. Which to change G or T to Y star. So this is like impossibility of fine tuning. So these are huge economies, and it's hard to be like, oh, let's just increase it by a little bit more. Are we there yet? A little bit more. It's going to be really hard to do that. It's also really, the difficult part is sometimes these temporary policies that are meant to kind of help us get back to Y star end up being permanent changes in policy. It's hard to have these temporary changes and then claw them back after the economy is recovered. So temporary versus permanent changes.